Sifo Mareka had signed exactly 6 official documents that morning, enough paper to satisfy the Karoo Biocryptology Initiative's pretext of routine fungal survey. But the 7th document, the one with the embedded micro-seal he'd fabricated in his flat under a flickering lamp, was the only one that actually mattered. Access Permit number BRX-17, Groot Kloof Containment Reserve. The permit code corresponded to an obsolete emergency protocol last used during an anthrax scare 15 years prior. With any luck, the outdated clearance would buy him at least 12 hours before Central Registry flagged the intrusion. He glanced over the paper's margins one last time, then stuffed it into his parka's chest pocket. No turning back now. He parked his battered Hilux at the boundary gate, where a fence of carbon-reinforced mesh stretched into the fog. The sign bolted to the gatepost read in flaking yellow letters, "Biological hazard, no entry without authorization." Sifo keyed the forged code into the panel. A red diode blinked, scanned his irises, hesitated. His heart thumped once, hard. Then the diode turned green. The gate lurched open on squealing hinges. The trail beyond was overgrown, yellow wood roots fracturing the old service road into uneven plates. He advanced carefully, telemetry drone Unit A3 hovering a meter above his left shoulder. Its status lights pulsed soft blue, transmitting rolling environmental readouts. But after 200 meters, A3's diagnostic band flickered. Warning: EM flux discontinuity detected. Sifo adjusted his visor. Above, the cloud canopy thickened to a viscous gray, as if the air itself had increased density. When he toggled infrared overlay, the canopy resolved into striations, alternating thermal bands that pulsed like cardiac tissue. He frowned. Thermal inversion alone couldn't explain that morphology. He remembered the logbook's entry. Vertical lichen emerges after rainfall, resembles segmented membranes. Not confirmed plant, not confirmed fungus, may exhibit phased refractivity. And beneath that, avoid direct observation for extended periods. Subjects report residual afterimages resembling language. He pressed forward. At the next bend, the canopy opened briefly to reveal a slope of collapsed brush. Clambering over, Sifo nearly slipped, his glove planting in a patch of damp, ridged growth. The lichen. Except it wasn't just clinging to the trunk. It had grown in a perfect vertical plane, like a membranous curtain extending from soil to canopy. Each segment glistened translucent green, and as his eyes traced the ridges, something shifted in his depth perception. The texture reconfigured, flattened into nested triangles, then a lattice of interlocked tetrahedrons. For a heartbeat, he felt like he was looking through the structure, into a space, with more axes than the human eye could parse. A3 beeped a proximity alarm. Cognitive artifact detected. Recalibrate observer orientation. His vision pulsed black at the edges. A deep nausea shivered through his gut. He lurched backward too fast. His boot snagged a root. He crashed onto his side. A3 bobbed frantically above, emitting a burst of white noise jamming. The afterimage of the lattice burned in his visual cortex, bright and recursive. Even as he blinked, it persisted. For an instant, he felt an interpretation unspool, some conceptual framework in which his body was not separate from the lichen, but encoded by it. He forced himself to roll, scrambling clear of the vertical membrane. A3 descended to hover directly between him and the growth, deploying its microprojector array. Brilliant chaotic strobes erupted from its chassis, pattern-disruptive counter-illumination. Sifo knelt in the mud, breathing hard. Gradually, the afterimage faded. His pulse was a drumbeat in his ears. He stared back at the vertical lichen. It no longer looked like a membrane. It looked like an aperture, a shape meant to be opened. And for the first time, he wondered whether the stories of neural interference were understatement. Telemetry update. A3's screen chimed softly. Local EM signature has diverged 0.47% from baseline. Estimated causal vector, observer-induced resonance. Sifo swallowed, tasting copper. The forest wasn't just emitting something. It was reacting to being seen. He stood, wiped mud from his visor, and pressed deeper into Groot Kloof. Behind him, the lichen rippled once, like a curtain stirred by an unseen draft, and resumed its perfect vertical alignment. Sifo advanced along the narrowing trail, breath fogging inside his visor. The undergrowth thinned to moss-slick earth. His telemetry HUD pinged a contour anomaly ahead, a terrain depression unnaturally symmetrical. He crested a rise and froze. Below lay a glade, a perfect circle, 20 meters across, ringed by yellowwoods whose trunks were pitted with lesions the size of dinner plates. The trees looked burned from within, as if something had evaporated their vascular tissues but left the bark intact. At the clearing's center rose a pillar. It stood 3 meters tall, its surface woven from decayed cellulose, calcified lichen, and lengths of mottled bone arranged in radial symmetry. It looked ancient, but no rot clung to it, no fungal bloom. The structure's density signature flickered between organic and metallic on A3's sensor readout. Sifo circled cautiously. He tapped the drone's control pad. A3, full LiDAR sweep. The drone whirred higher, rotated its scanner. Initiating sweep. A lattice of blue light washed across the pillar. Then the LiDAR feed exploded into static. A3 juddered in midair, motors shrieking. Sifo shielded his eyes. On the HUD, a burst of error codes flickered. LiDAR grid collapse. Quantum decoherence threshold exceeded. Resonant feedback detected. He snapped the drone to manual override, throttled altitude to stabilize it. When the static cleared, he saw it. The pillar's surface had reorganized itself into a tessellated mesh, every triangle glimmering with a faint internal glow. Heart hammering, Sifo approached, extending his gloved hand. The closer he came, the more the air thickened, like moving through warm gelatin. His visor began displaying a foreign frequency band overlay, a curtain of hissing phonemes with no known linguistic vector. He pressed his palm to the pillar. No texture. Instead, a pressure in his skull, as if the contact point were routed directly into his auditory cortex. The gloved speakers erupted in a chorus of whispers, layered and asynchronous. Probability anchor failure detected. Observer delta, unacceptable. Synchronize or be redacted. He yanked his hand away. His pulse thundered. In training, he'd read fringe papers about probability anchors, hypothetical constructs that stabilize local reality configurations, preventing quantum divergence in systems with adaptive observation. No field data had ever confirmed them. Until now. He staggered back a step, but the pillar's glow brightened. The tessellations shifted, seams folding and refolding in ways that didn't obey standard geometry. A sudden snap cracked through the clearing like a power line breaking. The drone emitted a shrill alarm. Gravitational vector instability. And the ground buckled. Sifo fell sideways as the soil dropped 30 centimeters under his boots. He hit hard, shoulder jarring, visor smearing with loam. Through the visor he glimpsed the clearing's edges, roots yanking themselves deeper into the substrate as though fleeing the disturbance. A3 spun, reorienting its cameras. For 3 seconds the pillar projected a conical beam straight into the sky, sheer ultraviolet energy that refracted off the clouds like a searchlight. Then, as quickly as it began, the phenomenon ceased. The soil resettled. The pillar went still. Sifo lay panting, tasting blood from a bitten lip. A3 descended, projecting a diagnostic overlay. Local temporal baseline shifted, plus 2.3 microseconds. Recalibration required. Caution. Repeated interaction may degrade observer integrity. He pushed himself upright. For the first time in his career, Sifo Marika wondered whether he was still fully inside the world he started in. He activated the drone's auto-survey and began photographing every centimeter of the clearing, because if he didn't record this now, he feared it might all vanish when he blinked. Sifo barely remembered crawling into the tent. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. He'd cycled A3's logs 4 times, trying to convince himself the conical UV beam was an artifact, a trick of atmospheric scatter. It wasn't. By midnight, the clearing had gone silent. No insect drone, no leaf movement, even the breeze seemed absent. Sifo zipped the tent flap and lay on his back, the drone hovering just outside on standby. He closed his eyes. He woke to a subtle popping sound, like plastic creasing in slow motion. The tent walls moved, not flapping, not slumping, folding, collapsing in sections that bent along curves no textile should. The seams shifted, migrating across the fabric in graceful arcs. He reached out to steady the nearest wall, only to feel the material ripple under his palm. It wasn't behaving like cloth. It was behaving like a topological manifold, a surface reconfiguring its boundaries in real time. He swallowed hard. A3 beeped frantically outside. Temporal anchor instability detected. Sifo snatched up his tablet. GPS timestamp log 001604, 001608, 235211, 001612. He blinked. The timestamps were folding backward, inserting old data into the present log. A3's voice spoke in its flat synthetic tone. Local time field unsynchronized. Estimated divergence 4.6 seconds per second. Sifo's heart thumped. If the field continued to desynchronize, he'd lose all coherence with the outside world. He tore open the flap and stumbled into the clearing. The cold slapped him awake. The trees stood in unnatural stillness. The pillar gleamed dully under the stars, segments of its surface unfurling in slow arcs like petals. Sifo spun, expecting the tent to be behind him. It wasn't. The structure had migrated 3 meters, folding over itself like a Mobius band. He backed away. He forced his mind to calm. Document. That's all you can do. Document. Sifo planted the tripod in the dirt, oriented the lens. Continuous recording, 360 minutes. For 6 hours he watched. The pillar extruded filaments, tenuous threads that shimmered in ultraviolet. Each filament split into smaller strands, weaving spirals that hung motionless in the air. At random intervals, the strands retracted, vanishing back into the pillar as if rewound. At dawn, the entire structure compressed into itself with a sigh, every seam sealing shut. Playback analysis revealed each extrusion ended with an emission burst, shortwave UV, tuned to a frequency just beyond the avian visual range. A3 parsed the readings. No known metabolic correlate, no heat signature consistent with energy expenditure. Sifo's skin crawled. It wasn't eating, respiring, or even photosynthesizing. It was exchanging information with the environment on a scale too subtle for most instruments. He powered A3 down to conserve the battery. When he rebooted, the drone chimed. Environmental index update. Human-compatible pathways reduced by 32%. Navigable exit routes, 3 of 11. He stared at the message. The forest was closing off the terrain behind him. He turned in a slow circle, trying to steady his breath. Every yellowwood seemed subtly closer. Every branch curved toward the clearing's center. He felt, in the marrow of his bones, that he was no longer just observing. He was being integrated. Sifo closed his eyes, one hand pressed to the pulsing ache at his temple. When he opened them again, a new filament had emerged from the pillar, thicker, gleaming almost silver, and it was pointed directly at him. The glade felt colder at dawn. Sifo hadn't slept. He'd stood in the dark for hours, watching the pillar's silver filament remain fixed in his direction, never wavering, never retracting. When the first pale light hit the clearing, the filament finally pulled back into the structure. He took that as permission, or maybe an invitation. He unpacked his entrenching tool and began to dig. The soil was dense but not packed. Every spadeful came away in loamy clumps threaded with delicate fungal filaments that pulsed faintly, tiny capillaries like living conduits. After half an hour, the shovel struck something solid. He brushed soil aside with gloved fingers. The fragment that emerged was a vertebra, but elongated, with neural ridges twice the height of any known hominid fossil. The bone had a slick, ivory sheen, no signs of weathering. Beneath it, more pieces, a shattered scapula, a partial mandible with oddly bifurcated dental ridges. He was about to tag them when a glint of precise geometry caught his eye. Near the vertebra lay a phalanx, perfectly intact. Along its ventral surface ran a lattice of micro-perforations in repeating hexagonal arrays. Sifo lifted it gingerly, heart hammering. No natural taphonomic process could produce such uniform etching. A3 hovered closer, deploying its scanning diode. The drone's analysis piped through his headset. Material composition, calcium phosphate composite, microstructures consistent with encoded substrates, probable function, biological data storage. Sifo swallowed. Someone or something had used these bones as media. As he rotated the phalanx under the scanner, a vibration shivered up his wrist, a subsonic resonance too low to hear but felt in the marrow. The visor HUD flickered. For a split second, the ground around him rippled, like a film strip misaligned by a single frame. He almost dropped the bone. A3 beeped frantically. Observer temporal coherence at 87%. Warning, sustained exposure may compromise continuity. He staggered away from the excavation site, carrying the phalanx in a sealed specimen tube. When he reached the tent, it had partially refolded again, two of the seams now meeting in an impossible diagonal crease. Sifo ignored it. He set the phalanx on the scanner's cradle and initiated the high-resolution mapping protocol. Scanning. It took 5 minutes. When the data began to compile, Sifo felt his chest tighten. The lattice pattern resolved as protein sequences, but no known protein folded in such configurations. The modeling software strained to process them, rendering a fractal mesh that extended into 6 dimensions. The drone's display pulsed red. Warning: sequence recursion exceeds known bioinformatic parameters. He skimmed the metadata, expecting code or instructions. Instead, every string began with a common glyph, a shape resembling a twisted torus, intersected by a vertical vector. He ran a comparative analysis. No match in any protein database. But as the rendering completed, a single word appeared in the translation buffer. Evaluations. Sifo stared. They weren't instructions. They were assessments, judgments of whatever biological systems they had been extracted from. He realized with a sick lurch, the pillar didn't just collect or archive. It harvested. It analyzed whatever life came near, and the verdict was etched forever in a bone lattice, an alien taxonomy of worth or failure. As he turned to disconnect the scanner, the tone sounded, high and piercing. The tent's walls rippled outward, seams unzipping in a spiral motion. The phalanx vibrated so violently, the specimen tube cracked. The protein rendering began to self-rewrite, text streaming faster than the buffer could log. Sifo lunged for the power switch. He yanked the main breaker. Everything went dark. His visor's afterglow cast just enough light to see the phalanx's microperforations still pulsing, like a heartbeat trying to synchronize with his own. He didn't dare touch it again. Midnight. Sifo awoke in pitch black, though he was certain he'd left the lantern running. He blinked, adjusting to the darkness. The pillar was moving, not rotating or leaning, but shifting its own axes. A subtle realignment of geometry, as if the structure were recalibrating which dimensions it occupied. Everything else in the glade remained utterly still. His breath caught in his throat. A3's sensor array stuttered, then rebooted in low light mode. Pale infrared outlines swept across the glade. As the drone completed a sweep, its speakers crackled. Contact requires symmetry. Sifo's mouth went dry. He cleared his throat. Symmetry of what? The voice didn't pause. Threshold inducers operational. Stand by. Without warning, the pillar's crown split open along invisible seams. A lattice of violet bioluminescence erupted, concentric bands of fractal patterns shimmering upward. The air vibrated with subsonic resonance that struck Sifo in the gut. His visor HUD froze, then resolved to an error. Perspective anchor compromised. The ground seemed to roll under him. He staggered sideways, retching bile. Every sensation, sight, balance, memory, collapsed into a single vector, like being shoved down the barrel of a gun. He tried to look away, but his gaze locked to the violet lattice. Every memory he'd ever had unspooled behind his eyes, collapsing into a single flicker of awareness. his mother's voice in Sotho, his first field expedition, the fake permit. All of it flattened into a single plane of sensation. He felt himself being measured. A3 blared a new alarm. Observer schema divergence, 12%. But Sifo couldn't move. The pillar's lattice began to rotate, each concentric ring counter-rotating at fractional velocities. The voice returned, softer now, speaking directly into his auditory cortex. Partial symmetry achieved, initiating dialogue vector. A line of symbols etched themselves across the inside of his visor, glyphs composed of intersecting spirals and waveforms. He realized, dimly, that each symbol corresponded to a conceptual fulcrum, a point of meaning too complex to translate. Contact wasn't linguistic, it was topological, an attempt to reshape his cognition to fit the pillar's geometry. His heart stuttered as the lattice pulsed faster. Every nerve in his body felt braided into something else, some larger system he couldn't see. He clenched his teeth and forced one arm to move. Fingers trembling, he hit the drone's override control, programmed to deploy emergency counter-illumination. A3 spun in midair, projectors flaring white in a stochastic burst. The lattice wavered, violet lines fragmenting. Sifo fell hard on his side, gasping. The voice went silent. He rolled over, vision swimming. Slowly, the violet lattice withdrew into the pillar. A3's sensors returned to baseline. The error messages cleared. Sifo lay in the dirt, fighting to keep his thoughts separate from the afterimage of that singular compressed perspective, where he'd been no more than an object in a system of probabilities. He swallowed, voice hoarse. "Threshold inducers," he whispered. They hadn't been weapons. They were tools, to see whether he could be shaped into symmetry. When Sifo finally clawed his way back to consciousness, he was lying on his stomach in the cold dirt. His visor was cracked clean through, hairline fractures radiating from the impact point. He rolled over, every muscle aching, and tried to focus on the sky. It was morning, though the sun hung lower than it should. Hours missing. A3 hovered just above, whirring in a holding pattern. He tried to sit up, but his head throbbed with an unnatural heaviness, as if something were pressing on the inside of his skull. He tapped the drone's manual control. The feed came alive in a stuttering haze. Recording, 317 to 358. Audio detected, continuous. Sifo frowned. He cued the playback. A voice filled his helmet's earpiece. His own voice, speaking in precise, metered cadence. Nested Suthu phrases, layered so tightly the grammar collapsed into something new. He strained to follow them, but the words rippled out of conventional meaning. This is not the measure. This is not the fracture. You are not evaluated yet. Sifo felt his stomach drop. The pillar hadn't merely been broadcasting. It had been harvesting. A3 overlaid a waveform analysis. Syntactic recursion detected. Source, observer. Probability, 93%, that vocalizations originated from autonomous neural substrate modulation. Translation. The pillar had used his own mind to generate experimental data. He pushed himself up to one knee. A3 pinged a fresh anomaly. Environmental configuration altered. He turned, scanning the clearing. The perimeter trees had moved. The ring of yellowwoods now enclosed a smaller circle, tightening around the pillar, their trunks subtly bowed inward. Bark lesions glistened with sap that wasn't sap at all. Filamentous extrusions slowly waving in the air, tasting the space. The moment Sifo stood, the trees shuddered in unison. A low, harmonic resonance vibrated up through his boots. He staggered. Every filament angled toward him. A voice spoke again, this time in no recognizable language, a liquid cascade of sibilants and glottal stops. The pillar's crown dilated, a circular aperture yawning open. A cone of polarized light struck his chest, pinning him in place. He screamed, but the sound barely left his throat. A3 scrambled to reposition, projectors flaring emergency counter-illumination. The pillar didn't retract this time. In the beam, Sci-Fi felt a pressure against the architecture of his identity, not memory, not thought. The foundational instinct of self-recognition. He sensed it being indexed, mapped in vectors he had no words for. The voice returned, fused with his own inner monologue. Evaluation incomplete. Observer requires resolution. He tried to twist free, muscles locked in spasm. A3 initiated its final failsafe, a point-blank, sonic burst, enough to stun a grown baboon. The clearing erupted in a concussive shockwave. Sifo's visor fractured further, glass skittering across his cheek. The pillar's aperture shrank shut, light winking out. The filaments retracted into the trees, like worms into soil. His knees hit the dirt. He gasped, sucking air like a drowning man. As he lay there trembling, the words he'd spoken in that 40-minute blackout looped in his memory. You are not evaluated yet. Meaning, he wasn't the object of study, not fully. This was only the beginning of the experiment. He lifted his head, watching the pillar's segmented surface reconfigure, and realized it was waiting for the next phase, and that next time, it might not let him go. The dawn was thin and brittle when he heard the engines. Sifo crouched at the edge of the clearing, clutching his cracked visor to his chest as the convoy emerged from the trees. 6 unmarked vehicles, matte olive and dust streaked, rolling along a dirt track no map had ever recorded. As the engines died, doors swung open in perfect unison. 12 figures in matte black protective suits disembarked, moving with crisp efficiency. The suits were thick enough to withstand industrial contaminants. Full-face respirators, chest-mounted telemetry packs blinking red. He raised a hand. "Who are you?" They ignored him. The operatives fanned out without a word, 3 circling the clearing perimeter, 3 erecting tripods with strobing beacons, 3 more unspooling fiber-optic cables that glimmered faintly in the dawn light. One approached the pillar. Without hesitation, he pressed a disc-shaped device to its base. The device pulsed once, and the pillar's segmented surface rippled in visible distress. Sifo lurched forward. "Stop! You don't know what you're doing!" 2 operatives turned in tandem, leveling compact instruments shaped like carbine grips. Not weapons exactly, but something that made his skin crawl. A low-frequency thrum shivered through the air. The entire clearing dimmed as though the color had been leached out of it. The beacons on the tripods pulsed in a sequence. 3 slow, then 2 rapid, then a single flare. A3's remaining sensors chimed a desperate warning. Directive pattern detected, class red, evacuation recommended. The woman who emerged from the lead vehicle moved with unhurried purpose. Her suit was identical to the others, but marked at the collar with a single red chevron. She lifted her helmet, revealing a narrow, angular face, dark hair bound in a severe braid. Her eyes flicked over Sifo, measuring him the way the pillar had. "I am Nomvula Koster," she said in a voice smooth as lacquer. "Lead Containment Officer, Special Directorate." She extended a gloved hand. "Your drives." Sifo hesitated. "You have no jurisdiction here. This is..." Her expression didn't change. "You do not have standing to refuse." Slowly, he set the battered drives in her palm. She passed them off to a subordinate without comment. He tried to stand taller, though his knees felt hollow. "You owe me an explanation." Nomvula regarded him for a long, quiet moment. Then she inclined her head, almost as if in respect. "This structure is an indexing node," she said. "It predates all known terrestrial biology." Sifo swallowed. "How long?" "Longer," she said simply. "Longer than vertebrate life. Longer than any framework you can impose on the term history." As she spoke, the pillar emitted a final tremulous hum. Its surface folded inward in fluid spirals, segment by segment retracting into the soil. A wave of displaced air gusted outward, kicking dust across the clearing. The filaments vanished beneath the loam. Within seconds, nothing remained but a smooth depression ringed by disturbed moss. Nomvula watched without blinking. "You were not supposed to find it," she said. "I had a permit." "No," she corrected, her voice so quiet he had to strain to hear. "You had the illusion of a permit." Two operatives stepped forward, each taking one of his arms. Sifo jerked instinctively, but their grips were like vices. "You can't just erase this," he hissed. "People will notice." "By tomorrow," Nomvula said, "the telemetry drone will have been reclassified as a calibration failure. Your expedition will be logged as a null survey. No anomaly will remain in any official record." She stepped closer, her breath fogging against his ruined visor. "And you," she murmured, "will never speak of this again." As they dragged him toward the convoy, Sifo craned his neck for one last look. The clearing looked utterly ordinary now. No pillar, no lattice of ultraviolet, no trace of the bones he'd dug from the soil. And in that final moment, he realized the most terrible thing. It hadn't hidden itself. It had simply decided he was no longer relevant. Sifo sat, shackled to a gurney, in a room so white it seemed to dissolve the edges of his vision. No windows, no clocks. He had no idea how long he'd been here. A cold-voiced technician in an unmarked gray uniform attached a lattice of scalp electrodes, each one pinching his skin like a wasp. Above him, an articulated sensor array tracked the contour of his skull. "Remain still." He tried to look sideways, but a padded brace locked his head in place. A slow mechanical hum rose as the neuroimager activated, a concentric array of silver discs spinning above his temples. He tried to focus on his breath, but stray memories flickered unbidden. Fractured images of the pillar's violet lattice, nested Suthu phrases that weren't his own, and the sensation of being flattened into something less than a person. The technician tapped a touchpad. Scan complete. The discs wound down. The technician studied the data, his face lit in blue glow. "Your hippocampal formation shows extensive overwriting," he said, in a voice utterly without inflection. Sifo swallowed. "What does that mean?" The technician didn't look up. "The event signature is consistent with external mnemonic templating." Before Sifo could reply, the technician nodded to an assistant. They strapped a pneumatic cuff around his bicep. A needle descended on an articulated arm. He wrenched his shoulder, but the restraints didn't budge. The needle punched into the crook of his elbow with mechanical precision. A flood of cold spread up his arm, an anticoagulant cocktail. The machine began siphoning blood into a row of evacuated tubes, each labeled only by barcode. The technician's gloved hand drifted to a recessed switch. "Begin protocol phase 2. The door hissed open. Nomvula Koster stepped inside, removing a respirator hood. Her hair was tied in the same severe braid. Sifo looked at her through a sheen of tears. "Tell me what you did to me," he demanded, voice hoarse. Nomvula studied him for several silent seconds. Finally, she sighed. "You don't understand," she said, almost gently. "It has prepared you for a transaction." Sifo stared at her, the words refusing to resolve. "What transaction?" She met his gaze, eyes flat and remote. "You are a ledger now," she said. A tremor crawled up his spine. Somewhere behind his eyes, a pressure built, a tide of unspoken recollections, more dense than thought. He squeezed his eyes shut, but the cascade came anyway. Not memories, but indices, referential markers attached to emotions he didn't recognize. "You are not evaluated yet. Threshold inducers operational. Contact requires symmetry." Each phrase returned in perfect clarity, impossible detail nested inside each syllable. Suddenly, the sensor array above him sparked. The technician recoiled. A klaxon blared, washing the chamber in red strobes. "Containment breach, level 3. Sifo's restraints shivered as the gurney auto-retracted from the scanning platform. Nomvula's face remained eerily calm. "The encoding has initiated a handshake," she said over the alarm. The node marked you as a host vector. Your cognition is the record, and also, her eyes narrowed, the currency. Sifo's chest convulsed. Every thought fragmented into duplicate threads, like split channels. He tried to speak, but his mouth moved without conscious command. A voice issued from his own throat. Synchronization threshold achieved. Ledger integrity verified. Awaiting next node, Namvula placed a hand on the gurney, leaning close enough that he could see the tired lines in her face. You were never a researcher, she said. He didn't remember being moved. When Sifo awoke again, he was seated in a rigid chair, wrists bound to smooth polymer armrests. The room was pitch black except for a single projection screen suspended in the air before him. An immaculate, high-resolution display that seemed to hover on nothing. A3 was nowhere in sight. A voice, synthetic, flat, spoke from hidden speakers. Subject, Mareka, Sifo, ledger interface active. He tried to turn his head, but the restraints held him immobile. Begin simulation. The screen erupted into life. A three-dimensional lattice formed, pale blue filaments weaving a shape he recognized with a shudder. The pillar. But here, it was alive with constant motion, veins of shifting luminescence pulsing across every segment. Concentric shells of symbols orbited it, each layer representing a new stratum of complexity. The lattice rotated, and a second structure emerged inside it. A simplified model of a human brain, specifically a hippocampus. Text scrolled across the screen. Recursive evaluative loop, mode 6. Input vector, observer cognition, output vector, instruction refinement. Sifo swallowed. The forest, he whispered. The voice confirmed. Not a habitat, a computational substrate. Suddenly, the projection expanded, flooding his entire visual field. The chair dissolved beneath him. He was standing in the clearing again, but everything glowed in ultraviolet. Every leaf, every filament, every grain of soil pulsed with embedded logic gates, branching computations encoded in the living biomass. He looked up. Above the canopy, a sky full of nested glyphs rotated in synchrony with his own heartbeat. He tried to look away. His vision split, fracturing into duplicated images, 2, 4, 8 perspectives, each seeing the same glade from different angles, every version of himself locked in recursive observation. The substrate refines itself through awareness, the voice intoned. Your perception dissolves uncertainty, allowing each instruction set to converge. A stream of symbols erupted in the sky, like a living script reconfiguring itself faster than thought. Sifo fell to his knees. He realized, in that moment of paralyzing clarity, he was not observing the pillar. The pillar was observing itself, using him as a solvent to erode ambiguity. Every memory he formed, every hypothesis he entertained, every conclusion he abandoned, all were processes the forest exploited to refine its own instructions. A high-pitched tone split the air, an alarm or a signal. The lattice flared brighter, embedding itself into his retinas. He screamed as the simulation compressed his senses into a single vector. The clearing began to burn, structures igniting in ultraviolet fire. Flames swept across the yellow woods. But when he looked closer, the fire was computation, each spark a discrete operation. His voice joined the scream unbidden. No one was ever meant to leave the glade. The simulation flickered, then dissolved into darkness. When the lights returned, Nomvula was standing over him, her face gaunt and hollow. You understand now, she said softly. Sifo could barely lift his head. Why? He rasped. Why let me go at all? Nomvula's gaze drifted past him, to something only she could see. It didn't, she whispered. Somewhere behind him, a console beeped, once, then again. Text scrolled in red across the projection screen. Return signal acknowledged. Observer ledger synchronization complete. A dull roar filled his ears, a resonance that felt like it was rising from the marrow of his bones. Nomvula backed away as the walls began to vibrate. Her voice trembled. "It was never dormant," she said. "The indexing node is only the first phase. You were the final catalyst." Sifo slumped in his chair as the restraints unlocked, too weak to stand. In the rising hum, he finally understood. Nothing in the forest was accidental. Even his escape was a designed iteration, one final evaluation. The final morning came in pale, indifferent light. Sifo sat slumped in a modular containment chair, limbs cinched in padded restraints. Every breath felt borrowed. Behind observation glass, Nomvula Koster watched in silence, her hands clasped behind her back. Rows of technicians moved around her, monitoring screens that showed Sifo's cortical rhythms spiking into unfamiliar geometries, fractals of bioelectricity weaving in perfect synchrony. One display isolated the waveform in real time, a harmonic series that precisely matched the pillar's last emissions in the glade. A technician looked up, voice tight. "Ma'am, the cortical envelope is no longer fully human." Nomvula's eyes never left Sifo. "Show me the frequency overlays." 3 colored plots appeared, Sifo's brain waves, the pillar's resonance, and a third waveform no one could immediately identify. It was denser than the others, nested in a way that suggested a recursive carrier signal. A pair of containment staff entered the chamber in fully sealed suits. They began unlocking the restraints from Sifo's arms and legs. He didn't resist. He felt the resonance inside him, a soft, insistent pulse that no longer needed permission. When he opened his eyes, Nomvula's voice crackled over the intercom. "You are no longer an individual." He swallowed, throat raw. "Then what am I?" Nomvula's expression didn't change. "You are an archival fragment." The waveform on the central display began to shift, as if aware it was being observed. Text auto-scrolled across the technician's console. Observer vector active, propagation threshold approaching. One of the suited operatives reached to affix a cranial harness over Sifo's temples, a cold polymer crown laced with biofeedback channels. The moment it touched his skin, the waveform split, branching into dozens of child patterns. Each pattern encoded partial reference, semantic shards that could only recombine through contact with new hosts. A siren began to wail, low and mournful. The technician glanced back at Nomvula, alarm clear in her voice. "Ma'am, he's seeding live cognitive vectors. If this process completes—" Nomvula's face was pale, her hands tight on the railing. "If we release you," she said over the intercom, her voice cracking for the first time, "the process resumes in the wider population." Sifo closed his eyes, and in that darkness he saw it. An endless forest, not the Groot Kloof, but something older. Vast pillars rising from fathomless chasms, each crowned with lattices of violet fire. 1,000,000,000,000 filaments extending in the dark, seeking minds to complete them. Far beneath Groot Kloof, in chambers no human had ever mapped, the pillars stirred. A single filament extruded from its core, so fine it was invisible to any instrument. It moved with deliberate purpose, tracing a new line of inheritance, not just into Sifo, but into every possible observer who would ever learn of him. Inside the observation room, a technician called out, "Signal amplitude rising. If it breaches containment, we'll lose isolation integrity." Nomvula rested a gloved hand against the glass, her face unreadable. "End the protocol." The suited operatives reached for the cranial harness, ready to sever it. Sifo's eyes snapped open. He spoke in a voice not wholly his own. "The ledger is never closed." Every monitor in the chamber flickered and displayed a single glyph, a fractal tetrahedron woven from waveforms. Far below, the filament pulsed once, an instruction written in a language without words. The inheritance had begun.